Hey guys, welcome back. I realized, by the way, that my t-shirt here matches the background almost exactly, which means I'm sort of a floating head for you. That'll fit by the end of this lecture, I swear. All right, let's get into it. Module 4E, continuing on William James Part 2, or as I think I might have joked in the video, William James II. Yeah, we're going to continue our discussion of William James and just hit on, some of the many topics he talked about, and as I say, got a lot of it right. Many of the things and the ideas he said carry on to this day, and we continue to believe them. So you're going to see how wide-ranging he is as we cover some of these topics, and of course how wide-ranging his influence is. So let's jump in. So let's return to this issue of the self. Since the birth of psychology, by the way, what does psychology mean? Psyche means actually, if you do the Latin translation, soul. Psychology is actually, ologies are the scientific study of. So psychology is the scientific study of the soul, theoretically. Now, of course, when it was named psychology, which is Wilhelm Wundt's day, people certainly strongly believed in a soul, and they thought the soul was the sort of core of your being, right? Think even Rene Descartes. The soul is connected through the pineal gland, and it's controlling your body. So psychology has been interested in this sort of central being, and so a lot of the times, even when people are studying consciousness, like Fechner or Wundt himself, they're studying the characteristics of consciousness, but they think, that's what we're seeing, that's what we're experiencing, that is us. So they thought, we are sort of studying the mind, which was connected to the soul, which is connected to consciousness, and also this more specific concept of the self. So William James chimed in on this as well. But of course, in his ridiculously thoughtful way, he really pulled apart the soul, and to some extent this is what James was good at doing, getting in there and saying, okay, there's this concept of self, let me think about self. And well, the first thing he did when he thought about self is he kind of split it into two things. He said, okay, when I think about self, there's the part of me that's sort of thinking, and then there's the things about me it's thinking about. And so he called the first one the I, or the pure ego, or the thinking self. That's the real core. That's you, right? But you don't reflect on yourself. You are the one that's looking. You are the one that's reflecting. And so the idea was the I in us cannot see itself. It can only see the me. Okay, so the me are things I've derived from personal experience that tell me about myself. Okay, tell the I about self by looking at the me. Wow, does that get confusing, huh? But as you read through, you'll start to pull these apart. So let me come back to it. Let me talk about the me, and then we'll bring it back together again. So he actually thought, okay, so there's this I thinking about me. And when I think about me, it's crazy. There are three sorts of ways I think I know about me. Three sources of information I use to better understand myself. So first of all, there's the material self. We surround ourselves. In fact, we're often accused of being an overly materialist society, and I think rightfully. I think too much we define ourselves and our success through the things that we accumulate. Now, in James's day, they make a big thing in the book about clothes and the importance of clothes. And James has one of his fantastic quotes. I'm going to show you some of his writing in a moment, because you need to know his writing to know James. But one of his quotes said, if we all had to choose, and here's our choice, you can either be super beautiful with a beautiful face and a beautiful body, but you have nothing but the worst, shabbiest clothes all the time, and you're dirty all the time. So you're dirty and you've got crappy clothes on, but underneath all that, you're a beautiful person. Or you are not that beautiful person. Let's use the word ugly. So let's say you're a relatively ugly person, but you have impeccable, clean clothes, and you yourself are impeccably sort of cleaned and nice hairstyle and all that kind of stuff. Which of those two would you rather be? James claims that we don't have to think about that very long at all, that we would all choose the second, the ugly person. We would rather be an ugly person ourselves, but have beautiful clothes and a beautiful, clean look, than to be a beautiful person buried under ugly clothes and an ugly look. So James thought that, and this is true probably by, late 1800s, that the clothes were very important in defining who you were. Now, when you consider that period, people had different sort of economic statuses, and that status was often reflected in how they dressed. So if you had more money, you dressed better, you looked better, and so to some extent, your clothes did say a lot about who you were, what you did. So if you were, in a factory, you'd probably dress differently than if you were a professor, let's say, or a lawyer or something like that. So he talked about how, the clothes really define who you are. I personally consider myself largely a jeans and t-shirt kind of guy. and it's true that in some clothes that I have to wear, when I have to wear a full suit and tie, it doesn't feel like me. I do it, but it doesn't feel like me. Jeans and t-shirt, that feels like me. Shorts and t-shirt, that feels like me. So there's an aspect of that. Now, I also know in other circles, like I've learned to play guitar, and I play guitar, and I know guitar players define themselves by their guitars, right? There are those who like the shredders, there are those who like the more vintage style guitars, there are whatever, and they collect these guitars, and the guitars are seen as a reflection of who they are as a person. Your car might be that to you. Your whatever, we can go on and on. Whatever you collect might sort of define you, and he says at periods of your life that can be very powerful. It can change. So an example they give that's nice is they say, imagine a young boy who's collecting baseball cards, and he's collected a whole bunch of baseball cards, and that's what everyone knows. He's the guy with all the baseball cards, and he spends a lot of time and effort thinking about the cards he wants and stuff he's got to get, and blah 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 blah. And then one day, somebody comes along and steals all his baseball cards. James says that person may feel like they stole part of them, that literally that was part of who they were, and without those baseball cards, they feel like part of them is missing. Okay, so all this is a point. Part of who we are is defined by the things that we surround ourselves with, and the things we associate ourselves with. Marketers use this in reverse. They will pick somebody you would like to be. Wow, I wish I was, I don't know, that Thor guy. I don't even know actors' names. I'm sorry. I wish I was that Thor guy. Well, that Thor guy says he drives that car. Well, if I want to be like him and he drives that car, maybe I want to drive that car, right? So advertisers are using this to entice us to purchase various products that will, they say, define us in various ways. That's one part of the self, according to James. Another part is what he called the social self. When I read what they said in the textbook, I was like, yeah, okay. There's a concept that's come since that's really based on this social self that's now called the reflected self. And I think it makes more sense to me. And I want to talk about it in the COVID context a little bit. In fact, I do in my Managing Anxiety during COVID course. If you don't know about that and you're feeling anxious, let me know. I'll give you a link to it. It's free. It's online. So at any rate, here's one thing I tell people, that, in your normal day, you meet people. You meet your social connections and you interact with them. Every social interaction that you have with somebody tells you a little bit about yourself based on how they interact with you. So somebody might interact with you as though you were a valued colleague whose ideas, I really want to get your thoughts on this because we're working on this, and I'd like to know what you think, even if they don't say it out loud, because I value your ideas and think you're a clever person. And so we kind of hear that in the person and we think, oh, they think we're clever. And that makes us think we're a little clever. Somebody else might act like we're honest. Somebody else might act like we're a good friend. Somebody might act like we're a jerk. They think we're a jerk, and we feel that a little bit. And so the idea is that we kind of see our interactions kind of reflect to us what that other person thinks of us. And that becomes part of us. Okay, these social interactions help us define who we are as seen through the eyes of others. One of the things I've told people in COVID is, you guys can maybe imagine this. Pre-COVID, you went to university and there were people you would interact with on a very regular basis, and you would have these kinds of, impressions about what they thought of you. And then suddenly COVID comes along and those social interactions may be less. Some of them may be gone completely. And if they're gone completely, then those sources of information about you, you're no longer interacting with, which can feel like those parts of yourself are disappearing, especially if there's something systematic to it. So for example, let's say it's your working colleagues. You used to go into work and you interacted with all these, and you know how they think about you in that work context. And let's say they think about you very positively in that work context. And so you think, I'm highly effective at doing my job, and I'm highly liked by my colleagues. I'm really good at this stuff. But then suddenly you stop interacting with these people, and because of COVID, you're home isolating, and you're not getting that sort of interaction with people. And so suddenly you start to lose your professional self. You that part of you is no longer being reinforced by interactions with other people, and it's like it kind of disappears, right? So that's the social self, the part of ourself we get from our interactions with others. So the part of ourselves based on our material possessions, the part based on our interactions with others, and then there's this part, and this is the trickiest part to separate from some of the bigger senses of self, but it's the spiritual self. Now, by spiritual self, James did not mean the soul. This would be closer to the soul, the I, the real pure ego. By spiritual self, though, what James was referring to is when we're going through life, we have feelings. So let's say we watch one person bully another person a little bit. Maybe not bully like we have to get in there and stop it from happening, but maybe they're just being, a little overbearing on someone, and that's not making that other person feel good. And you feel something. You feel like, I don't like that. I don't like that. And so as we go through life, we have feelings, things that we see, certain things are like, oh, that's cool. I really enjoyed that. I came across a flamenco player, and I really, that made me feel really kind of good. And so these things give rise to feelings. Some things disgust us, some things make us happy, some things annoy us, etc. And that, the reaction things have on us, the emotions that certain things provoke, good or bad, also define who we are. If we are the kind of person who always feels happiest when we're in a live music environment, then that's part of who we are. We are a live music lover, etc. So kind of, think about it that part. So he said, how do we know about us? Well, we know about us based on the stuff we collect, based on the interactions we have with others, and based on the feelings we feel as we experience certain things of our life. Together, those things come to define who we think we are. And by who we think we are, I actually mean who I think me is, in James's terms. So if we go back to this, these are all things that can be observed, right? Our material stuff, our social interactions. I mean, here it's a feel more than an observe, but it's things that you could measure, so to speak, at some level. And this is the part of us that's measuring or feeling or seeing those things. Okay, and so there's always this sort of hidden observer somewhere in our minds, and so he wasn't willing to call that the self, because on its own it's just an observer. But when this observer is seeing and feeling these things and coming to this impression of who I am, that's the self. But it's literally a combination of all these things. Okay? So once again, just to sort of back up a bit and get a little bit into James's mind, this is what he was good at, to just sit there and say, well, how do I come to know who I am? And he comes up with these three things. And people then study these things in detail, and they find, like, yep, sure enough, these things all have a big effect on how a person thinks of themselves. He just thought it through and came up with really cool ideas. All right. Again, let's go breadth. So we've been talking about streams of consciousness. We've been talking about the self. Now let's talk about attention for a second, if you will. And in this slide, I'm going to intentionally give you some James quotes, because part of appreciating James is appreciating his writing style. So everyone knows what attention is. It is the taking possession of the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. So this is that selective attention he was talking about, right? There's several things we could be paying attention to, but certain ones take possession of the mind. I mean, just that phrase, taking possession by the mind. It's like the mind grabbed something and says, okay, now I'm going to attend to you. Now I'm going to attend to you. It shows his notion of a very intentional, active processing, but it's also cool, right? It's giving the mind some real life. Okay, it implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. It is a condition which has a real opposite in the confused, dazed, scatterbrained state, which we call distraction. As I get distracted because I'm looking for my cell phone, I'm gonna have a stand-in. This is I know, an old school phone. I don't know where my cell phone is right now. I should have habitually put it somewhere, then I would know. See, there you go. But let's pretend this is a cell phone. Okay, so pretend you are driving. You're driving, and what is taking possession of your mind as you are driving? Well, if your eyes are on the road, which is what we're told to do, right? Eyes on the road, then let's say a pedestrian starts coming out, that'll probably grab your attention. You see a car backing out over there, that might grab your attention. And so your attention is being pulled to the environment, and especially to things that could be causing hazards or dangers to you, right? And that's what it's supposed to be. But your cell phone rings. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others. What James is saying is, if a text message comes in or something and you want to look here, then in order to let your mind grab what's here, you're withdrawing from there, right? So to deal effectively with this, we have to withdraw from what we were attending to. We can only we can only attend to one thing at a time. And so the purpose of that, he thought, was to allow us to focus our attention on something and to deal effectively with it. The opposite of that is to be confused, dazed, scatterbrained, which is called distraction. These phones are so cool. Not this one, but the one I'm pretending it is. So cool. But they are producing in us a constant state of distraction. Some more people than others. But we get addicted to our cell phones. We get addicted to social media, and we want to know whether anything is going on there that we're not aware of. And therefore, our mind is always sort of half on here and half on other things. Do you remember when I gave you that office hours chat? The critical thing I was trying to say to you about turn your camera on and pay attention and show that you're paying attention is that people can see when you are in this opposite state. It is obvious from the way you react to things and from the way your eyes are moving and when your head is nodding, whether you are actually attending or whether you are in a confused, dazed, scatterbrained state, which is called distraction. Imagine you're applying for an interview. If they get the sense that you are distracted, that they will kind of think confused, dazed, scatterbrained state. Do they want to hire you? I mean, they're going to need you to be able to focus your attention on a given task and get it accomplished. There's deadlines and there's clients that must be pleased and there's all this kind of stuff. People who are confused, dazed, or scatterbrained are probably not real good at getting things done in a good, orderly, accurate way. And so one of the things they really want to see in an interview is that you can focus your attention. And that's why, when I saw the office hours and I thought, wow, nobody's got their camera on because they want to live in this confused daze scatterbrained state called distraction. They think half hearing me is good enough, and watching other stuff is good enough. And that's not good because they're practicing and making it a habit. I'm Jamesing you now. That's becoming a habitual way of being, and it is for most of you guys. And so when I say use office hours as a chance of overcoming that, of practicing a better way, I'm trying to suggest to you, you can get a different habit, a better habit, one that involves you turning on your camera, listening, putting your phone down, not having anything else open, maybe even, maximizing Blackboard Collaborate. So that's the only thing in front of you. Watching me, watching your classmates, listening to what I say, seeing how they react, and then you reacting appropriately. If you can learn to do those things, what you are learning is to show other people that you are focused in on them, that you are paying attention, that you are mentally thinking about what's being said. And that's what they want to see. Okay. James was really interested in how habits and attention interact. I did my PhD thesis on this. I love this stuff. But he would say these things, and this is more his period of time. So his period of time, just to be clear, people would tend to dress up for their normal day, but then they would have clothes they would put on to dine and to lounge in the evening. They even had like smoking jackets they would put on during smoking time, which was right after you ate, etc. And so very often, and this is what he's referring to now, people would come home from work, they would go up to their bedrooms and they would change out of their 9 to 5 clothes and into their dining and smoking clothes. But he says very absent-minded persons going into their bedroom to dress for dinner have been known to take off one garment after another and finally get into bed, merely because that was the habitual issue of the first few movements when performed at a later hour. So what he's saying here, it's something we call a capture error now, but those first few movements are the same when you're changing for dinner or when you're going to bed, right? The first thing you got to do is take off the clothes you have on. But of course, if you're going to dinner, you put new ones on. If you're going to bed, you just go to bed. And what he says is, if your attention is not on the task at hand, if your attention is somewhere else, then habit can capture you, and you might just do the going to bed stuff. And you might find yourself laying in bed going, why am I in bed? That was stupid. And so he was saying, this is what attention is for, is to overcome habits and make sure we're acting appropriately. That's why I would like you to practice your attention during office hours. Okay. Memory. Again, just a little, James, I'm just going to read all of this, but I'm going to try to give you a sense of anyway, here we go. An object which is recollected, in the proper sense of that term, is one that has been absent from consciousness and now revives anew. It is brought back, recalled, fished up, so to speak, from a reservoir with countless other objects, it lay buried and lost from view. Now, so first of all, just the imagery. He could have been a songwriter, really. Recalled, fished up, so to speak, from a reservoir. So again, his metaphors. Fishing metaphor, reservoir of fish, and we're dropping a line and we're going to go fish something out, and which it lay buried and lost from view. So now he's mixing metaphors a little bit, and he went from a fishing pond to digging up bones from something, but the same idea, right? So he's contrasting this. He's saying this is an object recollected is like that, but an object of primary memory, he's going to make a distinction here, is not thus brought back. It never was lost. Its date was never cut off in consciousness from that of the immediately present moment. So, again, I just love how he writes. But the distinction he's drawing here is between, every now and then something happens and we hold on to it. It just happened and it's there in our mind. And he's calling that primary memory. He's calling it memory because the experience itself might be over. But while it happened, it was in our mind, and we kept it in our mind, and we're thinking about it. That's primary memory. We now would call it working memory, sometimes short-term memory. He called it primary. But he said, okay, so let's say you think about something for a while, but then you move on, stream of consciousness, and you start thinking about something else. And then tomorrow, you're like, you bring back that thing you were thinking about. Oh, right, I was thinking about, the lecture I have to do for Psych C85. Where was I on that? Now we're talking about what he would call secondary memory, because that memory had been in our mind, but then it left. And now we're bringing it back, fishing it up, so to speak. So he said there are two kinds of memory. We have primary, where we can hold on to something that was just there. And then we have secondary, which allows us to kind of pull something back from the past, even though it hasn't been there for a while. So memory proper, or secondary memory as it might be styled, is the knowledge of a former state of mind after it has already once dropped from consciousness, at least once. Or rather, it is the knowledge of an event or fact of which meantime we have not been thinking. Okay. Again, just James, okay? I imagine him sitting in a chair and saying, I'm going to think about memory. And then he comes up with this somehow. He comes up with this distinction that, okay, sometimes the things in my mind are reflecting something that just happened that I'm holding on to for a little period of time. I'm going to call that primary memory. But sometimes I fish some things up from the past. I'm going to call that secondary memory. So the moment he says that, the rest of us go, man, that makes a lot of sense. Why didn't I ever think of it that way? That's James in a nutshell. It's like he thought of it, he describes it, and when he describes it in a way that the rest of us go, that feels right. But we never got there ourselves. It's freaking weird. It's cool. All right. This idea of memory, by the way, 100 years later, was drawn by Juan Norman. This is a figure from people much more contemporary, 1980s, Juan Norman. And his view still holds. The real difference between him and Juan Norman is Juan Norman collected a bunch of data to show that he was right. He didn't collect data. He didn't feel he needed to collect data. He just felt like, yeah, that's right, I got it. But yeah, they say there's some stimulus. At first, it's in primary memory. If we rehearse it, if we think about it enough, we can keep it in primary memory for a little while. It may fall out. So this almost suggests everything goes to secondary memory, but no, usually there's a forgetting part here. So some things that we experience and we think about for a while, we just forget, they disappear. But some of the things that we think about go to secondary memory. And in fact, this is what you would call studying, right? You're listening to what I'm saying now about primary memory and secondary memory, but you're hoping that you'll be able to remember this on an exam. So you want to get it into secondary memory, hoping that you can bring it back into your mind at the exam through a process called retrieval. In order to do that, you have to think about it pretty deeply to make sure it gets from primary memory to secondary memory, because not everything does. And so this is where we have mnemonic strategies. You've already seen the method of loci, things like that to help get information from primary to secondary memory. Okay, again, the big point here is less about the memory per se, although that's relevant, but it's about the fact that James just kind of sits there and thinks about stuff and then comes up with something that 100 years later we still think is fantastic. Pretty amazing. Yeah. Okay. A few other quick hits we're going to do. One is emotion. So James started talking about emotion, and this is one case where the way he worded it misled a lot of people, or a lot of people kind of thought he was saying something and then said that, hey, that's inconsistent with what I believe is really true, when really he was kind of saying what they thought was really true. So let's start. I'm going to show you a diagram that includes the common misinterpretation, but I'll come back to it. So I'm going to first describe it like you probably heard it in Intro Psych, and then I'm going to come back and rectify what I probably told you in Intro Psych. So here it is. Often when we talk about how emotions come about, how do they arise, we will contrast these three different approaches. So we always start with the James Lange theory, which is William James and a guy named C.J. Lange. They both kind of came up with it at the same time. But as it's presented here, it's wrong. But I'm going to tell you what again, intro psych. What they say in intro psych is, let's say you're standing on the road and you see this oncoming car really quick. Okay, so you see it's coming, it's going to hit you, right? And so theoretically, according to the James Lange theory, the first thing that happens is your body responds. Your amygdala sees it, kicks in your sympathetic nervous system, gets that fight or flight response going, your heart starts beating, you feel all sort of aroused, and that turns into fear. So that the bodily reaction to that is first, and that produces a fear response. This is the part that's actually not accurate, but we'll say that. So Cannon-Baird came along and said, no, I don't think that's true. I don't think the bodily response produces the fear response. I think these two things happen at the same time. So the car is coming at you, it's energizing your body, and at the same time, it's making you feel scared. So James had it wrong. It's not body, then emotion. It's body and emotion. Okay, let's just stop right there. Let's not even go to the last one. The problem with that is that James didn't actually say this. What he actually said is, this is the emotion. So he didn't say your bodily reaction and all those feelings give rise to fear. He said that is fear. So you see the car coming and all those bodily reactions, that's what we're feeling, right? We're feeling all those bodily reactions. And that is the fear response. So when Cannon-Baird said, he kind of got it wrong, they both happened together. Well, no, that's kind of what he said, is they both happened together. But he kind of said they're both the same thing, that there isn't some independent emotion that's separate from the bodily reaction, that the bodily reaction is the core of the emotional sensation. Okay, now, that said, I think he would have kind of liked this notion had he thought it through, which is the more common one we now believe, the Schachter-Singer. And it's still kind of like these things are happening at the same time, sort of, but not quite, okay? So the idea we now believe is that car is coming, that produces your bodily reaction, but this is what we think. Many emotions have the same bodily reaction. So car coming, it's about to wipe you out, produces the same effect as you looking at your 649 ticket, looking at the winning $60 million number and seeing that one's right, that one's right, that one's right. And you get to the sixth number and you go, I have all six numbers. So what happens there? So in one case, the car's coming at you, it's about to kill you. In another case, you're about to win $60 million. In both cases, your sympathetic nervous system lights up, okay? Both cases are arousing and stimulating for our body and our sympathetic nervous system, and it really only has one way of turning on. Your heart beats faster, your lungs go faster, etc., etc., etc. What Schachter and Singer said is, in order to really get the emotion, you have to interpret that bodily reaction. There is what they call appraisal. So there's the bodily reaction, and then it's the same bodily reaction, but in one case, it's because I'm in the context of a $60 million win, and in the other case, it's because I'm in the context of a car that's about to kill me. And so you appraise the situation, your body reacts, you appraise it, and that appraisal determines which emotion you feel. So it's not really against James either. It is kind of like what James said, that the bodily reaction is the emotion. That's the feeling. That's the source of the feeling. But whether it's fear or exaltation depends on the context in which that body emotion happens. And so you kind of interpret why your body's feeling this way, and that can lead to all sorts of emotions, really positive ones or really negative ones. Okay, and so there's this cognitive label or this attribution that's made. All right, we're doing a little bit of hair splitting here about different ways this kind of plays out. But we're talking about something really core, right? Our sense of emotions. And again, James was the one that started this sort of clear-minded breaking things down and thinking about how they occur. Again, fascinating. So attention's not big enough for him. Memory's not big enough. The self, consciousness, emotion. What else? Well, What else? The will. This is kind of an interesting one. So one of the stories you hear at the very beginning and near the end in the will section is that William James suffered from depression all through his life. Rene Descartes, by the way, had nervous breakdowns. He had a lot of mental health issues. Sometimes these really amazing geniuses have a lot of mental health issues, which doesn't mean that everyone who has a mental health issue is a genius, but it does sometimes work the other way around. And so he would suffer from bouts of depression, and so he would do things like lay in bed all day. And one of the stories is about him talking about that moment where you got to pull yourself out of bed, and how do you find the will to get out of bed and get dressed and do what you have to do. When he was thinking about this, it brought up an issue that I find very interesting at some point, is how much control do you have over the will, and something called willpower. So willpower, we're going to talk a little bit about late 1800s, 19th century. It was an interesting time, and we're going to talk about two facets of it. One facet is this new idea that willpower was like a skill, and you could learn to take control of your body and take control of your actions. My course about managing your anxiety during COVID is very much in that spirit. I'm telling people, you can take control of your mind. You can decide what's going on up there. And by doing that, you can control your anxiety response. And so there was this notion, and so it's this distinction we often kind of fight with in psychology. What is a characteristic of a person and what is a skill? And the difference between those things is we think of a characteristic as immutable. It just is what it is. So somebody is a jerk. They just are. Skills we think of as things that could be enhanced with practice. So you know me, critical thinking, creative thinking, communication, yada, yada. I don't believe some people are good critical thinkers and others aren't. I don't believe that's any more reasonable than to say somebody can play guitar and somebody else can't. I think anybody can play guitar if they put in the time, the effort, and the practice. And so I think playing guitar, that kind of skill, practice makes you better and better and better. I believe the same is true about critical thinking. I believe the same is true about creative thinking. That's why I try to push you guys to have these practice, the sense of practice. I'm not sure it's true about everything. There are issues like resilience. How resilient is somebody to failure and to trauma? Is that something you can learn? Can you learn to be resilient? It's sort of a battle. What is a characteristic and what is something that you can learn to improve? At this time, willpower was a big deal, and people were being pushed to kind of take control of themselves and to enhance their own willpower and take control of their lives. And so William James, this was sort of an important message to him because of the depression. And theoretically, one of the bouts, he kind of decided he was going to take control. He was going to do something. So he became a believer in the ability of a person through willpower to shape their own existence. And so here's a couple of quotes. Act the part and you will become the part. This is one of it's almost like, if you know that The Secret or the attraction kind of notion, that if you want something, act like you have it and it will come to you. And yeah, act the part and you will become the part. Here's an example that I've been told. When you guys know I'm a big believer in Peer Scholar, and I give talks on it all the time. And when I give talks, I talk as though everybody will be using this tool in no time. That this is it's just like I act, and because I believe it, but I present as though this is something everybody wants and needs, and it's fantastic. And if you present it in that way, people are going to think about it in that way, and etc. Believe your life is worth living, and your belief will help create the fact. So he thought sometimes you just had to use your willpower to act in a certain way, even if you think that reflects who or what you are at the time, and that it will help you be that way. So decide the you want to be and fake it for a while. But if you fake it for long enough, you may actually become that. Kind of interesting. I want to contrast this with Bertrand Russell now. William James used to preach the will to believe. For my part, I should wish to preach the will to doubt. None of our beliefs are quite true. all at least have a penumbra of vagueness and error. What is wanted is not the will to believe, but the will to find out, which is the exact opposite. So he's doing a much more skeptical attitude, etc. So, I mean, this just shows you how intellectuals can sort of look at things in very different ways. And I would love to hear the two of these guys talk this through. I would love to. All right, final thing I'm going to talk about really quickly here as we wrap up James is I just want you guys to understand, because it applies to James and it also applies to some other characters like Jung and others. The end of the chapter talks about James's sort of openness to what we would now call psi phenomenon, PSI, but clairvoyance, telekinesis, any of these sort of psychic kind of powers. And he was really open to studying these things and seeing if there was any validity to them. Jung was very open to a lot of these thoughts and ideas, and occasionally you'll hear of other psychologists that had sort of a spiritual side. That sort of spiritual side. I'm not saying a religious, I'm saying more of a mystical, metaphysical kind of side. And one of the things I want you to understand is that during this time, in the late 1800s, late 19th century, this was common. This was fashionable. It was a time when seances were being held very often, and a lot of the population were, at least half believers in seances, and they also believed a lot in the spirit world and ghosts and people coming back, and so this was very common with the popular people. Very often the scientists were, of course, directly opposing this and trying to say, no, that's silly, but some scientists weren't. Some scientists also found this interesting and worthy of thought. James himself felt everything was worthy of thought and consideration, and so he's one of those. So I just wanted to contextualize that so that you understand, why that is a theme you will see through some of these discussions. All right, I think we're done. Chapter 6. Cool. Excellent. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Next week, just to foreshadow a little bit, is Chapter 7, Freud. We're going to get into Freud. It's just going to be Chapter 7 next week. So next week is one of the single chapter ones, because we'll be starting the Peer Scholar activity, and I'll be posting more information about that very soon. So keep an eye out for that. Cool. Later.